Après avoir obtenu son doctorat en médecine de l'Université de Toronto et son PhD de l'Université de Cambridge, Dr. John Fraser Mustard s'est joint à la Faculté de médecine de l'Université de Toronto. En 1966, il a participé à la création de l'École de médecine et de sciences de la santé de l'Université McMaster. En 1972, il est devenu vice-président sciences de la santé, médecine et soins infirmiers. En 1982, il a mis sur pied l'Institut canadien de recherche avancée. Dr. Mustard est alors reconnu comme chef de file de la recherche interdisciplinaire et de l'étude des déterminants socio-économiques du développement humain et de la santé. Il a assuré la coprésidence d'une commission d'études du gouvernement de l'Ontario sur le développement du jeune enfant qui a fait des recommandations précises à la communauté. Études sur la petite enfance. En 2004, il a fondé le Council for Early Child Development. Il travaille de concert avec les gouvernements du Canada, de l'Australie et de l'Amérique latine, la Banque mondiale ainsi que l'Université Aga Khan au Pakistan, afin de promouvoir l'importance capitale pour la société au développement de la petite enfance. Le Dr. Mustard est compagnon de l'Ordre du Canada. In her recent book entitled Mothers and Authors, The Evolutionary Origin of Mutual Understanding, anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hardy points out that the beginning of humanity, child development, requires mothers' cares and cares by others, family and community. The change in others in today's society requires new strategies to strengthen the support of mothers. Countries vary in the support of others and equity in early child development. Please welcome Mr. John Fraser Mustard for his speech.
Thank you. My theme of mothers and others comes, it's gone too far forward, I'll go back one, comes from Herdy's book because she posed a question. Infants of human beings are very vulnerable at birth. How did they ever survive during the hunter and gatherer society? Interesting question, because you and I wouldn't be here today if the mothers and others hadn't been able to keep the infants alive 150,000 years ago. So we're all product of mothers and others working. And so what did she sort of want to do? Well, she had all kinds of others that she wanted to work with, but one of the things that she chalked up in mothers and others is experience. And I'm going to talk about experience and how it affects development. And in the process of going through this presentation, I'll talk about genes, that's nature, but I'll explore briefly what I consider the major revolution in the biological sciences of this century, what we call epigenetics. Basically, that can be considered nurture, but if you ask yourself the question, you have over 100 billion neurons in your head, all with the same gene coding. Did you ever ask yourself how those neurons differentiate for the diverse functions, such as vision, sound, etc.? So we'll talk about that. We'll look at how this process appears now, our new knowledge, to affect pathways in health, learning, and behavior. It's no longer the bell curve, just genes. It's actually experience interacting with the putting into action the various gene functions. Then I will go into early human development, literacy, and health. Talk about some early child development programs that show what you can do. And then take you through some population studies which will contrast Scandinavia and Cuba with Canada. And then I will go through some conclusions. One of them is from the World Health Organization's report last year on Chapter 5 in discussing the subject. And they said equity from the start. And I'm using equity from the start for all children, regardless of social class. I'm not going to talk about targeted programs because basically if you're going to do it, you better make it universal. So mothers and others started to look at how early experience in the early period of our existence, perhaps 90% of our existence as a species, were hunter and gatherer societies. The men went out and hunted, and when they finished hunting, they tended to sleep. The women controlled the social structures in which the children were being brought up in, and they did not have our kind of family structures. You can have several fathers for a mother with children, but the women basically controlled that development, and that's how our species survived the first 90% of its existence. So she has looked at this in her book, Mothers and Others, and said if you look at our societies and social and economic structures, a hunter-gatherer society is pretty specific. It was the mums that did the job. The males dragged in meat for them to eat, but basically it was the mothers that controlled those little cultures. We moved to the agricultural societies 10,000 years, which was land ownership, and you now had to have somebody to help work the farm. So that's when you created really family units, with mothers managing one aspect of the farm operation, the children and the gardens, etc. They were pretty successful. Then we went through the Industrial Revolution, which we finally learned that clean water was important. It was only in the middle part of the 19th century that Great Britain realized that it had to put in clean water. A relatively recent discovery, and we still have the problem about clean water, as you know, in our societies. That led to better nutrition for the populations, which is one of the reasons why people started to live longer. And now we're in a, what people call a post-industrial society where people move around, the family structures are distributed, not condensed as they were in earlier periods of time. A lot of people in Toronto are living in condominiums, which are not very good places to create a mothers and others climate, if you think about it in terms of space and interaction. So Hertie thinks we got a problem, and I agree with her. So to take you into a quick story about the neurobiology of development, on the left-hand side of this slide is nature, genes, yes? They're important. On the right-hand side of this slide is nurture. We never had a biological explanation for nurture until very recently. The geneticists working in the field of plants and animals, etc., have pointed out that the genes are basically the same in all the cells in plants and animals, but something allows them to differentiate for different functions, and that's the epigenetic effect. And so experience affects gene function. The gene stays normal amount of DNA, but the epigenetic effect regulates which of the genes get turned on or turned off for the cells to function. And so that turns down to gene function. And as far as what we're going to talk about today in development, we're going to talk about neurobiology. And developmental neurobiology affects risk for physical health when you're young, but also when you're in my age group. And I will be at risk of my life when I was very young in terms of my neurobiological pathways, which has huge public health implications. It also profoundly affects mental health and behavior. It also affects your capacity to learn. So that's why we see all these things linked together when you start to look at populations on a broad base of how they're developing, their health is like, what their learning capacity is like, and what their behavior is like. So that's a simple explanation of a very complicated but exciting news story. So let's look at the stress pathway. My colleague, Bruce McEwen at the Rockefeller University doesn't like the word stress anymore. He talks about load, he has a fancy term for it. But basically, if you think about stress, you wouldn't have gotten out of the bed this morning if your stress pathway hadn't kicked in. But fortunately, it settles down. Now, my stress pathway will be up because I have to talk to you. But when I finish, I'll go back to sleep. And so it's a very cleverly regulated process, but you can screw it up. Because if you think of it as a system which is a biological thermostat, which is normal for your everyday function, when it kicks on, you don't want to leave it active because too much cortisol being produced affects all the cells in your body. And it's an important factor causing disease problems. So we're going to look at behavior and epigenetics from that standpoint. And so one neurological pathway that you can think about is something called the limbic system, or the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis. But sensory stimuli coming in from the outside world, a mother talking to you, music, temperature, etc., feeds in through core structures in the center of the brain. And your biological pathways pick up whether something that is happening to you is dangerous, such as seeing a rattlesnake in Ontario, potentially dangerous. That will fire into the structure on the left called the amygdala, which will affect the structure in the middle called the hypothalamus, which will stimulate the neuroendocrine pathways to stimulate your glands in your kidney, adrenal cortex, to produce cortisol. So that's the positive side of why you got up this morning and how, when you're in difficult circumstances, you can get stimulated. But you don't want the cortisol circulating all the time because it affects all the cells in your blood and your body. So on the right-hand side is a structure called the hippocampus, and it has a sensor for picking up the cortisol levels in your blood, and it's the sort of thermostat that shuts the system down for you. Now, if you have trouble setting that hippocampus function, which Michael Meany at McGill has pretty well given us the answer for it, there is a receptor on the hippocampus which senses the cortisol level, which puts the signals into the system to shut down the system producing the cortisol from the adrenal gland. So that's a biological thermostat. And the other story on this, which I don't have time to go into, it looks like this has huge effects on the prefrontal cortex, which has huge effects on neurobiological pathways that affect learning and physical and mental health. So that receptor on the hippocampus is pretty important. And so what Meany and his colleagues did is they looked at their rats, and the rat mothers that provide high licking and grooming, high LG on this slide, for their pups in the first 6 days, those animals developed with modest stress reactivity, well controlled. They could take risk easily. They were pleasant. They didn't bite you. The rats, pups which had poor licking and grooming when they were young, as they grew up, would be aggressive, would fight you, would bite you if you tried to handle them as they got older, and a distinct behavior difference. And that's stunning news, because that says the environment of licking and grooming has a profound effect on the development of that biological pathway, which we now think is a pretty clear demonstration, even in humans, as to what it does. So what Michael and his crew did, they applied one aspect of knowledge about epigenetics to that receptor, because if the gene for that receptor doesn't turn on, then you're not able to regulate the cortisol levels. So what you have here is low maternal care on the left, and what you find is that the gene which produces that receptor gets excessively methylated. Methylation of the cytosine base in DNA, it's one of the 4 bases, will shut the gene down. On the right-hand side, you see good maternal care, and you see the genes not methylated. And so if in your early development that gene structure does not get properly influenced by the epigenetic process, you run the risk that when you become angry and mad, that you'll stay angry and mad. Now, as Dorothy McKinnon, who's with me, knows, I can get angry and mad in my office, but I settle down when they dump on me fairly quickly. They work on my biological thermostat. And so if you look at the cortisol story, overproduction affects behavior, depression, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, memory, immune system function, drug and alcohol addiction. Huge burden of public health problems in adults is actually set in early life. And that's why public health people have to become far more aggressive in getting their communities to understand this. And this affects all social classes. And you can have underproduction, which I don't want to get into now, but if you see that biological thermostat story, you understand the important part of this neurobiological pathway. So what stimulates the neurons in your head to differentiate for their different functions? And so we're going to look at what experience is. These are the stimuli that you encounter both pre- and postnatally, as well as later age stages of life that affect neuron function. And the examples are obviously sound, touch, vision, smell, food, thoughts, drugs, injury, disease, etc. Alcohol is a drug. It will affect these processes. Nutrition will affect these processes. So experience stimulates the neurons in the brain through sensing pathways to set their functions. So you have the gene story and you have the epigenetic story, and the epigenetic story causes the 100 billion neurons in your head to differentiate for different functions, even though the DNA stays the same. Now this is a nice, neat experiment in mice. This is a strain of mice that when they grow up, they become yellow fur, big and fat, and they tend to get diabetes. So the clever scientist doing this 10 years ago said, wow, we know about epigenetics, and we know that diet has an effect on epigenetic processes. So they put into the diet of these mice some extra vitamin B12 products, which affect the processes of methylation of genes. And what you have on the right-hand side of this slide, and looking at the thymus gland, the liver, the kidney, the brain, is the degree of methylation, in this case, of the critical gene that affects the glucocorticoid story. And you can see that the animals on the right have extensive methylation. This is a little different than what Meany found in his work. The animals on the left don't have much methylation, and they'll grow up big, yellow, and fat, and be kind of mean. The animals on the right will be small, trim size, normal weight mice. And so for those of you in public health, this is a powerful story about how nutrition affects the epigenetic process and how you can actually change performance if you give the mothers who've got the adverse gene structure to actually shut down that gene so that their offsprings will not have that deficiency when they become older. Now, another neat trick, we don't quite know the answer to this, but it's important for all of you in mental health. The serotonin transporter gene, labeled 5-HTT on this slide, and depression. This is the Dunedin births cohort set up in 1970. And what they did, and this is true in rhesus macaque monkeys, by the way, if these adults have the short gene structure, the gene is normal, but it's short, then they're brought up in severely abusive, neglectful families, their risk for depression is high. So SS is the short gene structure. If they have the long gene structure, they're actually resilient, even though they're in adverse circumstances. So this starts to explain why some people who have an adverse early development actually are resilient to the effects of that environment. Very important to think about that when you're looking at populations. And you can see that if you have the short gene structure and you're brought up in a good environment with no abuse, neglect, and good support, you don't have an increased risk for depression. We suspect that this is an epigenetic process. And so it means as you start to look at this and look at this from a public health perspective, you now have to think about the epigenetic effects and you have to think about the gene structure. The genes in these individuals, the only difference is in their physical structure, short or long. The DNA is normal. So if you take a look at what the Swedes did, looking at, they didn't do it for this purpose, but the data shows this is space. What they did is they looked at adult health in Sweden in terms of general physical health, circulatory health like heart attacks, blood pressure, and mental health problems. And they had records about what early development was like for this population. So what was life like in the time of birth and later on? And 0 means it was good, and they gave that the value of 1, so these are odds ratios. And if you had adverse circumstances, severe adverse circumstances, for your general physical health was 2.5 times as bad as the ones who had a good period of early development as a child. If you turn to circulatory, which is things like blood pressure and heart disease, it's so way up, and this fits the work that came out originally from the United Kingdom about something about early life affected the risk for heart disease. And the bottom shows you the stunning data on mental health problems. And so if you don't believe that early development has profound health effects, you need to read through this paper and rethink what you think about it and put it back into what I was trying to explain to you about developmental neurobiology. So, well, let's look at literacy and health, because obviously you want children to go to the school system so their cognition is good and set and they can proceed forward. So what we now know about language in early development, it starts early. The first 7 months, it actually begins in utero. The brain starts picking up the sounds and differentiating them. And if you're spoken to in 2 languages during the first 7 months, such as English and Japanese, and you continue, you'll speak both languages fluently with no accent. So since Canada is a bilingual country, if we were smart, we would have all our young children exposed to both French and English. Now, I tried this out on the New York community that's in daycare here. They all wanted to do that because they understood this rule. Your government wouldn't let them do it. It sets capability for mastering multiple languages, which is important because how the brain's getting set up. And it basically sets the literacy and learning capabilities for the second and third stages of development. The second stage of development is primary school. The third stage is your secondary school system. So if you want to think about it diagrammatically, the sensing pathways that let you see things and let you hear things, yellow, they start to function before you're born. And their development is largely over by the age of 4. Language kicks in once those pathways get started, and it's largely over by the age of 4. But when they get set, you can now go into the school system and take higher cognitive functions. But basically, that early pattern is going to determine how able you're going to be in the school system. So one of the studies that Hart and Risley did was to look at what they called the dose effect. High SES means high social economic circumstances. Middle SES means middle. Low means poor. But there are some poor who are up in the high performance level, and there are some people in the high performance level who are down in the low performance level. And what this showed everybody is that in the first 3 years of life, your basic verbal language skills are being set, which actually are the trajectory that will stay with you through the school system. This says if you want to get at the literacy question, you better spend money on early development. And so one of the things that's come out of our work with the EDI, which was developed at McMaster, it's the Early Development Instrument, which is a crude macro measure of brain development at the age of 5. And on the left-hand side are the number of children at the age of 5 who are vulnerable by this measurement. Good ones are 0, and the bad ones have 4 to 5 dysfunctions on the measurement tool. Then if you look at these children in grade 4, 13% of the children with no vulnerabilities by this criteria passed the grade 4 test. 48% of the children with 4 to 5 vulnerabilities failed. Now, anybody in education knows that children who are having difficulty will not come into the school to do school-based tests. And so if you combine those for the population and with the school failure rates, you can see that 68% of the children who should be in grade 4 who are very vulnerable don't succeed in having a literacy base to go forward. For those of you in public health, this is an important item of information because you have a responsibility to ensure that all the development of young children is optimum so that you do not have any of these vulnerable children at the time of school entry. And if you look at this, even the children with no vulnerabilities by this crude test, some of them need help. So that's why anything should be universal if you're going to do it. This is a New Zealand study in their Department of Education, reading scores ages 5 to 14. The left-hand side shows that children at age 5 who are in the top quartile of performance on a screening test at school entry. And you'll see the mean values are going across those black dots. So the bulk of them stay above the mean. Now, if you go to those that start below the mean at age 5, the bulk of them stay below. There is some movement, that is true. But the point is that you really don't get big changes in the school system. So what they did is they looked at those that were in the highest quartile of this assessment at age 5. They looked at them at age 14. And those that were in the highest quartile at the time of school entry, close to 90% of them were still in the highest quartile in the assessments of student performance at age 14, in both mathematics and reading. Those that were in the lowest quartile at the time of entry at age 5, close to 90% stayed in the lowest quartile throughout the school system. So any of you in education that are concerned with literacy, don't let the bureaucrats in education dump on you to improve literacy. Dump on the public health people to improve the literacy performance of language skills of the children before they enter the school system. Can you do that? So let's look at what the applications of this are. Let's look at early development and adult literacy and health, because I'm arguing that the neurobiological development of the brain in this period basically setting functions in health and learning. And so the OECD has done an assessment of adults in developed countries in terms of their performance in adult literacy. And level 1 is pretty sad. You basically, as a physician knew these people, they couldn't easily understand a prescription to take a medicine on an empty stomach. And the level 2s had the same kind of problem and also had problems with surgical consent forms. Level 5s are brilliant, and you referred to the institute I started called the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. I interviewed everybody we brought into the program. One of them was Mark Renault, who some of you know in Montreal. And I basically was selecting level 5s because I expected them to be able to work across many disciplines to try to move an agenda. Interesting, isn't it? So when you look at the United States distribution in terms of this literacy assessment, level 1 is low, level 5 is high. Only 5% of the US populations at level 5 are populations the same way. If I were the government of Quebec, I'd pounce on all of you to improve the development of people's literacy if you want to be a competitive province in today's world. Level 4, you go to university. Most level 3s probably have problems going to universities, but we'll see that as we go along through all this stuff. Now, we yak a lot about poverty, but if you're not very able, as measured by measurements of numeracy and literacy, you're not going to get easily employed. So this is the US literacy thing in that study using wages. And so you can see that the level 1 people, by wage income, a huge chunk of the level 1s are in poverty by that definition. There are some in level 5 who are in poverty, but I have 2 kids who are homesteaders in Cape Breton. Cape Breton is not a place where you have a high income. So technically, by wages, they're poor. Their father does give some subsidy, but they subsidize themselves. But where they live, they're not in poverty. They live in an absolutely splendid world which they can do things and they exist with independence. So when you're looking at poverty, you have to be careful how you do it. But it does say if you want to get rid of poverty, you better start investing in early development. Now, since I'm trying to link health and learning together, the Americans, when they did this study with the OECD, then looked at health problems, mental and emotional problems, and long-term illness. And you can see that close to 50% of the adult population 16 to 65 had health problems. Less than 1% at level 5. And so therefore, as public health people, you really do have to drive your society to understand these relationships because the burdens of cost for managing health care problems are huge. And I'll show you later on the cost of putting in good early development programs is cheap compared to the cost that we're paying at the present moment. So, in summary for this part, experience-based brain development in the early years of life sets neurological and biological pathways that affect throughout life health, physical, mental, learning, literacy, and behavior. And if the public health people don't want to take responsibility, for this? Who's going to do it?
Will do.
Okay, good. I like that. And so to summarize this, early experience affects gene expression and neural pathways. It shapes emotion, regulates temperament and social development. It shapes perceptual and cognitive ability. It shapes physical and mental health and behavior in adult life. It shapes physical activity, skiing, swimming, and hockey. And I can't understand why my English-speaking colleagues are so stupid. Because if you learn to ski at the age of 3, you'll be a hell of a lot better skier than if you learn to ski at 30. Now, all of you know this because of all your hills, and you take your kids out early. At least that's my suspicion about what goes on around here. But Anglophones in Ontario, they're clueless about this. And you'll notice in hockey, we like to be good at that. Well, you better begin early if you want to have good hockey players. No different than learning, etc. And it shapes language and literacy capability. So these are all functions of the brain. So what's the evidence that you can do something? Well, the first one comes from a British epidemiologist who worked in Jamaica, Grantham McGregor. And she took stunted children at birth, the bottom part of this slide, and put them into 4 groups. Do nothing, called control. Nutrition supplement, the blue. Stimulation, the yellow, or giving nutrition and stimulation together. And by the age of 2, 24 months, these children are beginning to approach the children of normal height at birth. That's dramatic, because that simply shows you the huge power of the experience in early life in doing this. And you know that she uses the term stimulation. And stimulation can be provided through play. It can be provided through language. It can be provided through touch. And so when you start to look at that, that's a pivotal thing to get across into the system. Then the other thing, which is kind of a natural experiment, is the Romanian orphanage study. And what the first set of data showed that children that were adopted within 4 months of going into the orphanages did a lot better than the kids adopted after the children had been 8 months in the orphanages. And these orphanages fed them, but the staffing ratio with these young children was very, very low, and I don't know what the quality of it was like. And there's the abnormalities in brain function at the bottom of the slide: abnormal brain development, small brain, low metabolic activity, abnormal electrocardiogram, EEGs, social and cognitive problems, IQ loss, high vulnerability to behavioral problems such as ADHD, aggression, and quasi-autism. They call it quasi-autism because it's a hard diagnosis to make, but it begins to hint that autism is probably a product of environment in the early years. Chuck Nelson, who was in part of these studies, then took children who were in the orphanages and placed them in foster care. Now, since Romania did not have foster care programs, they trained the foster parents. So these are very well-trained people who are going to take up these children, but they weren't the biological parents. And as the most recent paper of his on this, he says, foster care, when placed in foster care, are approaching normal, but those are the children that were youngest, under the age of 2, placed into the foster care program. A recovery that sadly does not seem to be occurring in children first placed in foster care after the age of 2. And so if you're dealing with orphanages and those kind of problems, it's a hugely important lesson if you want to give those people the chance for good development by moving in early. The other one, which I love, is the study that doesn't get a lot of push on this. Olds and other people tend to beat it out. But this one is a study done in North Carolina where they took African-American children at birth and randomized them into 2 groups. One group, at the age of 4 months, were put into a very sophisticated year-round preschool program. Very well run, by the way, expensive, but very well run. The other children were left to pick up whatever the parent structures could pick up for them in North Carolina. Then when they hit the school system, they were again randomized. Half went into a special 3-year program in the school system, and the other half were left in the standard school system. So here what you see is the reading and numeracy data for this study. The blue bars are the kids given the special 3-year school program but did not have the preschool program. They have an effect in the school system, but you gradually lose that. And you saw that when I showed you the New Zealand data about performance of children who are not doing well when they come into the school system. The yellow bars are the kids given the preschool program. They come in and do extremely well, but they gradually lose the effect, but they still have a gain. The kids within the green bars that had the preschool plus the special 3-year program, they make big gains and they hold. That's the best demonstration I can give you of neurobiological data in terms of development in reading and numeracy and literacy. It's dramatic. It's all we know about developmental neurobiology. And if I were a public health officer, I would know this and work with my community to get my community to understand it, and more importantly, to make sure my cabinet ministers understand it. And you better check out what you think their literacy rates are really like.
We'll talk to Dr. Poirier.
Right. So what's the population data? Well, the population data, basically from the people at the Brookings Institution, you should start early, which you people know, often, and be effective. So we argued in Ontario when we did our reports, early child development and parenting centers. Now that phrase, I now realize we use, it's a kind of a mothers and others phrase, because early child development and parenting centers have to go back and replicate the mothers and others function. So they should involve parents, children, and staff, and they should be available from pregnancy to school entry, preferably on one site, preferably on the site of the primary school, provide support for the parents in centers and home visits, learn parenting by doing, integrate with primary schools, and parents can teach each other, provide non-parental care, yes, let mothers work, nutrition and stimulation, make sure that you appreciate that stage 1 of human development is conception to at least age 6. And that's basically what you're doing. You're setting up for the next stage of development. So creating structure, infrastructure for early child development parenting centers. Support and fund high-quality early child development centers. Provide relevant education and training for the staff. Integrate with the primary schools. Establish outcome measures. Establish whole-of-government approach. Have one government ministry responsible for seeing this all gets done. And don't put public health in your health care domain, because health care is to deal with diagnosis and treatment of sickness. That's not what you do. I said, oh, hope you don't do that.
No.
All right. The center should be accessible, available, and affordable for all families. So let's look at the Scandinavian and Latin American countries. If you look at child poverty in Scandinavia, compared to our figure when this was done, where we have 15% of our children, and this may not be, I think it is probably true in Quebec as well, as I looked at some of the data. Look at the Scandinavian countries, less than 4% of the children are in poverty. Hey, are they richer than we are? No, they're not, but they have different public policies in terms of social environments. And the right-hand side shows you the adult literacy levels in 4 and 5. That was done at the time this poverty was done. 36% of the children in Norway are at high levels of literacy performance, 4 and 5, only 23% of Canadians. How do you and I expect to compete in a global economy where we can't get more of our people up at levels 4 and 5? So this shows the document literacy. I won't take you through all of that. It simply shows, looking at Sweden, when this study was done, 34% are at levels 4 and 5. In Canada, it was only 23%. Australia is 17%. The United States is 18%. Chile is 3%. And Mexico is 1.7%. And we've been working intensely with Latin American countries to get them to come together to develop integrated programs to improve the literacy of their countries to be competitive in today's world. And I'll skip that one since we don't have enough time. I'll skip that one. So when you plot the gradient in literacy in relation to the parents' level of education of adult people, you'll notice that there are two gradients that are above the mean for developed countries, which is the horizontal line. They are Finland and Sweden, and Norway would show the same category. And you notice that those slopes for the adult population are not as steep as the slopes for Canada, which is the red slope. And we have about 1 third of our population below the mean for developed countries. Australia is about as bad as we are. The United States is actually a basket case. Now, the United States has lived off importing talented immigrants, and they're still pulling them in from Asia and places like that, but they're not producing this in the whole population. And the Latin American study is still on the bottom in terms of the purple for Chile. And so the Latin American countries have a huge challenge. So let me turn to a country called Cuba. I know it's communist. I'm not praising communism, but I am praising what they did to improve human development. And I was sent by the government of Canada to Cuba in the 1970s to look at their health reform. And so one of the places I went to was a polyclinic. I didn't know what the hell a polyclinic was. I thought it was a primary care unit. It wasn't a primary care unit. It was a center for healthy early development. They were clean, they were spacious. Pregnant mums were there, mums with infants and toddlers. I said, well, that's pretty impressive what they're doing. And they then later on came to what they call Educate Your Child, kind of trying to put in an early child development program in 1994. They got to 90% of their children. But UNESCO came in 96 and 97 and assessed children's performance in the school systems in Latin American countries, including Cuba. The study was done by outside people. It was not done by the propagandists in Cuba. And I want you to know this was, one of my colleagues was actually on the study. So we said, well, that UNESCO study would be sampling children at around age 9. Since Educate Your Child didn't come in until 1994, and you now know that we understand that the early development has big effects, there had to be something that was going on before that did it. Basically, we think of now as the polyclinics, and we're going to write a paper on this. But this is the UNESCO results. This shows a horizontal line, which is the mean value in language scores in grade 3 in the school systems in Latin America, and a bunch of countries which sit around the mean: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. But look at the one that's on the right. That's Cuba. Its mean value is 2 standard deviations better than the mean for all the other Latin American countries. We have never seen a difference that great in any comparison across countries. So you have the second poorest Latin American country by wealth, is the way we judge it, producing an impact on its early child development, which is stunning. And if you don't know Cuba, I don't know you can find out much about it now because it's changing, but that's an extraordinary performance. And so we tried to look at what the polyclinics do. It's developmental health, not healthcare. That's why public health should do it, because you're not primarily concerned with healthcare. You're concerned with the health and development of the population if you're doing a job right. So you should all become polyclinic bosses. You provide nutritional support. You do provide child care. They don't call it that in Cuba. They're very cultural. It's a little more than child care. And what they were able to do in the polyclinic structure, they visited every pregnant mother once a week. And that home visiting program was carried on until the children got older and went into a center-based program run by the polyclinic. So we tried to get the Cubans to cooperate with us to let us look at what their children are like when they leave the 0 to 6 domain and come into the school system, to apply the EDI to the children. But then we ran across a bureaucratic problem. The Cubans had not moved into education having responsibility for early development until recently. And they knew that the real reason for the performance, I think, and they never told us this, in the UNESCO studies was because of the polyclinics. Well, you don't want to give health credit for something that you think you're good at, do you? So they blocked us. They've been blocking us to this stage and doing it. So Alfredo, an Ecuadorian who works with me, and I said, well, if early brain development affects health, and infant mortality is a measure of health, what happens if we plot infant mortality for Latin American countries against the UNESCO test results in grade 3? We're basically trying to get an idea of brain function. And the white line is the infant mortality rate for Latin American countries. And you can see on the left that Cuba has the lowest infant mortality rate. And the colored line shows that it has the highest language scores. And as you trace that out, the worse the infant mortality rate for the countries, the poorer the language scores. So if you understand that health and language are all measures of brain function by these criteria, that's kind of impressive, isn't it? And we took the under 5 mortality rates as well, and we got the same result as we looked at that. So that fits that we really do know that early biological development of the brain, neurobiological development, affects health, learning, and behavior, and you can now show this in population studies of countries. Since we couldn't crack into getting the Cubans to cooperate, we have a small package of characters in Monterrey, Mexico, who have adopted aspects of the Cuban program. They will tell you it's not the same, it's ours. I said, that's okay. But what they've done is they've looked at the EDI on the children in the SENDI program. The number of children in this assessment done by Magdalena Janis was 341 that were in the center-based program that begins with pregnancy and has healthcare or health people involved in it. The other children are children, this is in a poor district of Monterrey, who just picked up what they could. And the percent vulnerable by the EDI in the SENDI program is only 18%. That's the crude macro measure, but 38% of the children not in the SENDI program in the community were vulnerable. So then Magdalena, she may be in the audience, but her data allowed us to look at the percent low in one domain from the SENDI program. She had standardized the EDI test to be used across different countries. And then we looked at Canadian middle-class children at 25.9% are vulnerable. So that's why, sir, you have to make this universal. And if you look at the percent low in two domains, the SENDI program, the children is less than 4%. Close to 13% of our children in middle-class families are vulnerable. So we have a way to move forward looking at that. So how do these other countries do it? Countries like Sweden, et cetera. Well, I was stunned to find that the Swedes now run their early development program under the Ministry of Education. There's one government ministry. I would call it, they should change the title to the Ministry of Human Development, but that's to come. At least they got it right. You want one government ministry allowing it to be integrated. And our government's treatment of our Aboriginal populations is an absolute disgrace in this area. It's all fragmented and it's not integrated and coordinated. And you need to wallop your government, I don't know, wherever you wallop them, to get them to understand that you want to integrate this. The Swedes spend per infant, toddler, and young children, this includes the parental leave policy, which you get 80% pay when you're on parental leave, $16,500. The enrollment in the program, depending upon the age, gets up close to 96%. It's not compulsory. But coming back to mothers and others, smart mothers know where there's a good place for them to join in with their children to get a gain for their children. That's why mothers and others. We males are not very good, sir.
We hunt and go out of the cage.
The compulsory school structure, which begins at age 7 in Sweden, they spend $10,500 per child, but the staffing ratios are different and there's no parental leave costs. So obviously the Swedes and the Norwegians have caught on to the fact that you have to put more money into it. So if you wanted to do this in Canada, we have about 2.1 million children in the 0 to 6 age group. If you did it with the same basic themes that the Scandinavian countries do, it would cost us about $22 billion per year. That's a lot of money, and the governments will say, we can't afford it. Well, that's true. We can't afford it with our current attitudes. But if you look at the crime and violence cost to Canadian society, to individuals and communities, remember, crime, behavior is rooted in early development. If you've got problems in crime, you're probably not going to be part of the economy in the ordinary sense. And think of all the justice systems you have to work and lawyers you have to pay to handle crime and violence. So that's why that cost to individuals and society is over $120 billion a year. And this was done by the Ontario Mental Health Group at the Psychiatric Unit at the UT. They looked at mental health, behavior, and drug use for individuals and society in Ontario, and it turned out to be about $33 billion a year, so we just multiplied it by 3 to get up to the population. So that cost is over $100 billion a year. Now, sir, how much money are you spending in this province on handling the problems of human disability? You should do that. But don't you think it would be nice if 25 years from now you could turn that around? And there's more than enough money to fund high-quality early development programs in your savings. So you have a responsibility to make our governments affordable.
We try.
All right. So when the World Health people issued Michael Marmot's report on the social determinants of health, Chapter 5 is marvelous. It says equity from the start. And of all the units we have in our governing structures, public health is a pivotal group to try to get us to understand what equity from the start truly means, and that's for all children. And the science of ECD, early child development, shows that brain development is highly sensitive to external influences in early childhood, starting in utero, with lifelong effects. That was a marvelous conclusion from that report. Nobody in government seems to understand it. And then recommendation 5.1, WHO and UNICEF and UNESCO should really get together and create an integrated program. And to do that, they're going to have to come to the concept of human development so that you link health and education together in a very effective manner for doing it. And I will go on to this. And so mothers and others, the results were also discouraged. She says if you're not looking at in the 21st century, mothers are not doing as well as they did in the past. Now we can't do a comparison on that, but that's her analysis and looking at it. And that's true. If you look at the huge population growth, what urban centers like Montreal and Toronto are like, you don't have good mothers and other things, but if you want to do that, you have to build centers that are easily accessible and affordable that mothers and fathers with young children can be partners in early on. That will cost us $22 billion a year, but it's peanuts compared to the cost that we pay because we don't do it. So unsettling is the finding that 15% of children in normal middle-class families exhibit symptoms of disorganized attachment and poor behavior. She has not gone into the literacy and behavior in her analysis, but she spotted this as taking place. And so Ontario has a report that will be in competition with you. We may not be as smart as you are because you have a better social culture than we do in Ontario. But recommendation 1 in the Pascal report, which I love, and this is the government of Ontario. McGuinty asked for this report by Pascal, and he did it and gave it to the Ministry of Education. The province should create a continuum of early learning, child care, and family supports for children from the prenatal period through to adolescence under the leadership of the Ministry of Education. So they want to go to one government portfolio. They don't include public health in this, but I would drop the term education. If you do this, you should call this the Ministry of Human Development, which allows you to link the health and education themes together. And I won't worry about that one. So what I'd like you to think about as public health people are working with public health, why don't you persuade your government to create a Ministry of Human Development and drop the terms public health, drop the terms education, etc., to provide an integrated structure for human development so that the next generation will be highly capable of coping with the complex world in which we exist today. So that's my end of my sermon for you. And there are a bunch of references on this website if you want to look it up. So thank you very much for listening to it. Put on my French-speaking phone, sorry.
Eh bien, Dr. Mustard, vous nous avez livré une conférence tout à la fois scientifique et axé sur comment la science devrait influencer nos interventions. Comme jeune père ou jeune mère, nous avons tous lu un bouquin publié il y a plusieurs années qui s'intitulait « Tout se joue avant 6 ans ». Ça fait peut-être 30-40 ans de cela. Ça a été publié et là, vous nous donnez des informations scientifiques, physiologiques, comment que ce n'est pas seulement le bagage génétique qui influence le devenir santé de nos enfants en termes d'adultes, mais et on le savait que les environnements influencent la santé, mais vous nous le démontrez de façon incroyable et vous nous suggérez des pistes d'intervention pour faire en sorte de diminuer énormément les problèmes de santé et les problèmes sociaux. On vous remercie pour cette conférence et je suis convaincu que des personnes dans la salle pourront vous poser quelques questions de précision, mais j'en aurais une en commençant. Vous nous parlez du rapport Pascal pour l'Ontario. Pouvez-vous nous donner quelques informations privilégiées de l'accueil que l'Ontario fait à ces recommandations récentes?
Ontario is a bit of a complicated story. I was asked through the then Deputy Minister of Education in South Australia to come down there and talk to them about what should be done. Their Deputy Minister was a very enlightened man, and they had a Premier who wanted something done about early childhood. So the end result was I ended up working out at the Premier's office as what they call the Adelaide Thinker in Residence. I've never been treated like this before or since. I never had to worry about what I was going to do or who was going to deliver Dorothy and me to different parts of that state. We were always organized to do it. And a very sophisticated team of people working with us, and I was working out of the Premier's office. That deputy minister who got me involved in that then left South Australia and went to Wales, but then he was recruited to become the Deputy Minister of Education in Ontario. That was a fabulous step forward because he had a real understanding of this, and it's clear that McGuinty wanted to bring in somebody at the top of the bureaucracy that could create a whole-of-government approach, and that's why he recruited him into it. Unfortunately, he's just died with cancer of the pancreas, but the impact of his presence is there, and that's why they got Charles Pascal to prepare this report. And as far as we can tell, McGuinty has bought everything because one of the directors of education I've worked with for a long time, Jim Grieve, he has now been appointed as Assistant Deputy Minister to implement the recommendations for the report all the way through. Now, he's got a lot of problems. So, how do you get the health people to behave themselves and the education people to behave themselves? Because they all have neuron problems as well. And so, but Jim is doing this, and I'm doing my chore with him because I think in 2 weeks' time, Dorothy, he's bringing 15 of his colleagues that he has to work with into my office, and we will brainwash them about this the way we've had here, but a longer period of time. And then I've suggested that they set up a webcast program that we can do out of Toronto, go to all the regions of the province to take this through. So they're serious to do it.
Good. So we'll try to do better in Quebec, but I think we have to work hard.
Glad to help you.
Est-ce qu'il y a quelques questions dans la salle pour Dr. Mustard concernant cette très bonne conférence? Vous êtes tous un peu comme moi, assis dans votre chaise à penser aux prochaines étapes que vous allez faire dans vos organisations. Pas de questions, moi non, pas de questions. À ce moment-là, je vous remercie. I thank you very much, Dr. Mustard, for your speech this morning. Avant de vous envoyer à la pause, j'ai un petit message publicitaire tout petit. Vous avez jusqu'à midi aujourd'hui pour signifier votre